Hi, today I'd like to speak about what I'm referring to as hairy politics, and to ask the question, what after all is in a braid? Something in the Chinese context in late imperial Chinese history, very significant. For men, hair and politics were closely intertwined during the Qing dynasty, and the dates of the Qing dynasty are 1644 to 1911. As the image here shows you, and it's called Politics of Men's Hair in Chinese History, there are these different phases of Chinese history and corresponding hairstyles that go with each. And the transition from one to the other is very meaningful in terms of the politics and power of that period of time, who was in control, and why did they impose certain kinds of hairstyles. So what we see here in three different parts is, on the left, you have antiquity to the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty goes from 1368 to 1644. Then we have the period of the Qing Dynasty that I just discussed, which goes from 1644 to 1911. And then after the Qing Dynasty, there's a revolution in 1911 that overthrows the Qing Dynasty. And after that, we have the Republican era and the beginning of a new hairstyle. So really what I want to concentrate on here is the Qing Dynasty period, when you see the hair style with the braid. So again, during the Qing Dynasty, we see this hairstyle, and it was required of all Chinese men. And what we refer to it as, what we call it, is the Q style. In my title, I refer to it as the braid. It's also referred to as the pigtail, but the way in which historians typically speak about it is the Q, Q-U-E-U-E. Chinese women, on the other hand, during the Qing Dynasty, were not forced to change the way they wore their hair. So this was something that was imposed on Chinese men, but not on Chinese women. The question I want to ask then is, why were men required to adopt the Q? And the image I have on this screen here, it comes from a contemporary Chinese film, and it may be recognizable to you if you have watched Chinese historical dramas set in this period of time, that for an American or a Western or rather peculiar looking hairstyle. That's what I want to discuss in today's lecture. So in order to do so, we have to talk about the Qing Dynasty and what it was. The most important point here is that the Qing Dynasty was a foreign-controlled dynasty. It was not controlled by Chinese people, but rather by the Manchus, who were a different people who took power from the Chinese-led Ming Dynasty. And again, the dates of the Ming Dynasty were 1368 to 1644. The Manchus took control of Ming Dynasty controlled China in 1644, and they did this by means of military invasion. When they took power, they established the Qing Dynasty, and Qing here refers to the word pure, or the concept of pure, and that dynasty lasted until 1911. It was a very long dynasty. The map here shows you the origins of the Manchu people. You can see Manchuria here on up in the upper right-hand corner of the map. And the darker blue color there is the place from which the Manchus, the political organization, the population that attacked China, from which they came. They moved southward and then across the Great Wall into China, and captured Beijing, which was the capital of the Ming Dynasty, and there they stayed as the Qing Dynasty. The picture on your right is simply an illustration of siege warfare of these walled Chinese cities that the Manchus conducted in their invasion of China. So this was a violent overthrow of the Chinese order and the imposition of a new order by a non-Chinese people, the Manchus. And the Manchu-led Qing leaders, once they came to power, then imposed the traditional Manchu hairstyle on all Chinese men. And we see an illustration of that here. This was not the first time we see this kind of hairstyle in this part of Asia. Centuries before this, actually at various different points in time, other tribal peoples, people who were organized in sort of tribal configurations, who invaded North China and sometimes gained control over big swaths of territory in North China. They too wore their hair in a way that looks somewhat like we have here. They also imposed their hairstyle on at least a small number of the Chinese people. But what we're looking at and talking about now is the latest iteration of this phenomenon, and the one that by far and away is the best known and the most famous in certainly in modern Chinese history. The person who was the top political figure when the Manchus came to power in 1644 was this individual here. His name was Dorgan. He was not, in fact, the emperor. The emperor was a child at this point in time, and Dorgan then ruled as a regent in his stead. And in 1645, shortly after coming to power, the Manchus, led by Dorgan, issued a decree that all Chinese men must change their hairstyle to that of the Manchu people, the Manchu male population, that is wearing the queue. And what this involved was shaving the front part of the head roughly all the way back to the back, and then wearing it in a pigtail in the back. And the images that I'll be showing you show that the way in which this hairstyle looked in particular actually shifted across the length of the Qing dynasty. Well, not surprisingly, some Chinese at this point in time were very uncomfortable with this, and they argued that to adopt the Manchu hairstyle would be tantamount to rejecting the Ming dynasty, to which they swore their loyalty, even though the Ming dynasty was no longer in power. This, therefore, was objectionable to them. Dorgan's reply: "If officials say that people should not respect our rights and music, but rather follow those of the Ming, what can be their true intentions?" And the idea here certainly is that if they refuse to wear the hairstyle that we are decreeing, that means that they are unwilling to surrender to our power and authority, and therefore they are enemies of our regime. Dorgan's decision then, in response to this, was to say, you either cut your hair, you either adopt our hairstyle, or you face execution. In other words, then, the choice was either lose your hair and keep your head, or keep your hair and lose your head. During the Ming dynasty, and earlier in Chinese history, men grew their hair long and then folded it up and wore it in a top knot. And the figure here on my far left then is wearing his hair in the style of the Ming dynasty. The prized feature then was that the hair was long, that it was flowing, that it was full, and this was something in which men took great pride. To adopt the Manchu style then was to admit defeat, was to admit that you had been conquered, and to submit to the Qing rule and to the appearance of what the Chinese viewed as the barbarians. The Chinese viewed all non-Chinese peoples beyond a certain distance from China to be barbarian, and to look like a barbarian by adopting the Manchu hairstyle was, of course, something that many Chinese, in particular in certain parts of the country, were extremely loath to do. In North China, where there had been a much longer history of intermixing with peoples from north of the Great Wall, and some of those peoples, as I mentioned before, already had introduced and enforced hairstyles that were similar to that the Manchus were imposing, compliance among Chinese was a rather quick phenomenon. But further south, especially in East Central China, large numbers of men refused to cut their hair, which was tantamount, as I've said before, to declaring that they rejected the Qing dynasty. And for this, the Manchus sent in troops, surrounded these walled cities, starved them out, and then went in and massacred men, women, and children by the thousand. If the Manchus spared a man's life, what they would do is force their captive to endure the indignity of having his hair cut forcibly, and that is illustrated in this image here. You can see the man looking down, having no control over what the men who are conducting the haircut are doing, and you see cowering there also other captives who have already had their hair shorn. So while this was a rather abrupt and, in certain parts of China then, brutal phenomenon, by 1700 or so, perhaps 1725, I think we can say that most Chinese men and male children had already come to accept as standard this new, or no longer so new, Manchu hairstyle. It was not a controversial issue any longer. One of the interesting things that we can note here, and this was observed by all sorts of foreign travelers to China, was that Chinese cities were full of itinerant barbers who would walk around and set up their little stand and shave men's heads on a regular basis. These, of course, were the men who had this done were doing so completely out of their free will. Because maintaining one's queue required a visit to the barber almost every 3 or 4 days. So this was a good occupation to have in urban China during Qing times. Obviously, these photos come from a far later period, but this is probably very much what one would have seen before the advent of the camera. So as I mentioned earlier, the required look of the hairstyle was not constant across the 250 plus years of the Qing dynasty. As time wore on, more and more hair was permitted. So you can see at the beginning, the figure on the upper right is wearing his hair in a very tight little braid, and the rest of his head is shaved. Actually has 2 braids. We go down to the middle figure, the middle period of the Qing dynasty, and more hair is permitted, also on the face. We go to the end period of the Qing dynasty, and we see much more hair, and we see that now it is being shaved up to a certain place on the head. So it takes on the look of those men that we saw in the very beginning of this lecture from the film clip. So it was a changing look. It was not a constant. And then the figure on the other side of the arrow there, of course, is wearing his hair in the more traditional style for Chinese men, and certainly the style of the Ming Dynasty. So you can see the shocking difference between the way in which people wore their hair in 1643 and the way in which they were forced to wear their hair in 1644 and thereafter. But by the middle of the Qing, the queue had become so thoroughly accepted that it had developed into a status symbol. Chinese men of good standing, of taste, were proud of their full, lengthy, and elegant queues. This was something that they tried to do in the best way possible. The longer, the fuller, the more probably wealthy they were, the better care they could take of their hair, and so forth. So we go from a period of time when there was real disgust with this hairstyle to a period of time when it has become naturalized as being Chinese, and something that people take pride in, and which the different quality of actually differentiates different Chinese from one another in a sort of status hierarchy. Westerners who traveled to China or who saw Chinese in their own countries reacted to the queue with scorn. To them, it suggested the Chinese were weak and uncivilized. And because they also understood that it was imposed on the Chinese by the Manchus, they also saw this as an indication that the Chinese were a subservient, enslaved population. To give an example, in 1830, the missionary Erasmus Doolittle, who left a lot of notes for us that historians find very useful and interesting, this figure, Erasmus Doolittle, stated that men wearing the queue made him actually want to laugh. And he said of a man, "His cap is fantastic, and his head is shaven except on the crown, whence hangs down a tuft of hair as long as a spaniel's tail." Okay, it looks exotic. It looks funny. It can be compared, the hairstyle, to the tail of a dog. And then, as I said, it wasn't only those who went to China who observed this and made fun of it, but also in the United States, for example, and in other Western countries where there were Chinese laborers. And there were many Chinese who went to California during the gold rush, and who fanned out across the country and were very, very important players in the construction of the cross-continental railroad. So there were a lot of Chinese, and these tended to be uneducated men, poor men, who were extremely hard workers, but they did not get across this idea of a highly cultivated, cultured people. And therefore, it was easier to disdain them. And there were many Americans who deeply objected to the presence of the Chinese in the United States, and who worked very hard to force them out of the United States. And their language and their illustrations were very racist by today's standards, who focused oftentimes on the queue, on the hairstyle as a kind of sign of Chinese backwardness and barbarity. And here we see a cartoon from this period of time in which this is very apparent. The Chinese figure looks almost like a cartoon figure. It doesn't look like an actual human being. And of course, his hair served as something that the man can grab onto, like a tail, and then whip him, and hopefully whip him so hard that he leaves the United States and goes back to China. So all of this was in the lead up to the Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed in the United States in 1882. And during that entire lead up period, and then after as well, because not all Chinese were forced to leave, it was simply that new Chinese were not allowed to come. The queue during all of this time then was this very conspicuous symbol in illustrations and so forth of the backwardness of the Chinese male laborers. And we can see in these various different cartoons here, as well as in the sign, the anti-Chinese sentiment, and in the two illustrations in particular, the representation of China and the Chinese man, with the queue flying behind him as he runs. Of course, the queue is unlikely to be flying that way. In running, it is put in that particular way to emphasize the kind of hilarity and backward look of a Chinese man. And I thought I would show you a few illustrations here just to make clear that Chinese who came to the United States really did wear their hair this way. They maintained a very Qing dynastic look. This comes from what was considered the best Chinese restaurant in San Francisco, Hang Perlo, from the middle of the 1880s. And we can see all these men here at this table with their long braids going down the back. So they brought this look with them to the United States, which is a point that's already clear. There were a series of photographs taken by the photographer Arnold Gent, and these are, I think, very moving photographs. I'm just going to show you two of them. I would say that Arnold Gent is a very different kind of figure here. He is somebody who is deeply interested in the Chinese, who is empathetic to them, and who wants to capture them as human beings with feelings and faces that convey human emotion and meaning. So here we have one. This is on the streets of San Francisco, a man, and Gent entitled this photograph, "A Proud Father," a man holding his young child in his arms. And this one I like very much. This is, again, from San Francisco Chinatown, roughly the same period of time. While this could be ridiculed, it also is quite cute. We see the children, these little boys, staying together by holding one another's cues. Now, this looks to me much like preschool children in the United States walking down the street holding a rope so that they're all together. So this is a very practical thing to do. Of course, it draws attention to the cue. These little boys would have had no self-consciousness about this. They were in the United States, but they were in Chinatown in a thoroughly Chinese atmosphere. Were they to venture outside of Chinatown, they certainly would have faced a great deal of racist looks and probably comments as well. Okay, by the late 19th century, China had been through one war after another, had lost every single one of them to Western powers, and had been forced to open up what were known as treaty ports, and then on the coast, and then other places in the interior of China to Western imperialist domination, to missionary work on the part of Christians. In other words, China had suffered quite terribly at the hands of Western imperialism. And this was a period of time in the late 19th century when many Chinese felt that China was falling low among world's nations and that it had a great deal to do to catch up, that it had to reform itself. And some of these reformers, even though they themselves were people who wore their hair in the queue, started to fixate on the queue as a tangible sign of Chinese backwardness, as something that was embarrassing to wear in the presence of foreigners, as something that led to ridicule and the feeling among foreigners that China was backward and not with the modern times. And these people actually started to agitate for removal of the queue, relaxation of the imposition of this decree on the part of the Qing leadership. They wanted, in other words, to make China modern, what they considered to be modern, by changing their hairstyle. Of course, this was only one aspect of becoming modern, but it was something very symbolic and important to people. And one of the ways in which the people who were thinking about this sort of couched their presentation was by focusing on what was happening in Japan. The modern look that was being adopted in Japanese cities, and in particular by the Meiji Emperor, who we see here, who looks who is dressed like a Western style monarch or military leader. The Japanese did not wear their hair in a queue style before this, but the very fact that they were becoming more and more Western in appearance sort of shined the light on how much different the Chinese looked from the modern appearance that the Meiji Emperor and others in Japanese society, other men in Japanese society, symbolized. So there were these reformers, as I've just mentioned, who were seeking relaxation of the hair decree of 1645. But these reformers in the last 5 or 8 years of the 19th century and then the early years of the 20th century failed to persuade the Qing dynasty to modernize the country politically and in terms of its social institutions. And therefore, many of them left the ideology of reform, which would have left the Qing dynasty in place, and moved instead to the ideology of outright revolution, violent revolution to overthrow the Qing dynasty, to overthrow the Manchus who controlled China, to return China to Chinese control violently if necessary. And one very important, loud-voiced figure at this point in time was this young man named Zhou Rong, who we see pictured here, who accused the Manchus of destroying China and who called for the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, and outright he called for the murder of the Manchu people. I would call attention to Zhou Rong's hairstyle here, as well as his dress. Nothing here looks like the Qing dynasty queue-wearing man. And this cut hair that looked, and the wearing it in what looked like a kind of modern style Western fashion is the way revolutionaries tended to look. Certainly this announced them as people who were opposed to the Qing. The Qing at this point in time had become so weak that it had little ability to enforce any kind of serious arrest and punishment of people who had changed their hair to this new style. Clearly, though, the Qing took the meaning from this and realized that the opposition, the revolutionary sentiment within Chinese society, was growing very strong. So in 1903, Zhou, the same figure who I just discussed, wrote, "When a man with a queue wanders around London, why do all the passers-by say pigtail or savage? And if he's in Tokyo, why do they all shout Chan-chan botsu," which can be translated as pigtailed Chinaman? I call attention here to the terms of derision, the self-consciousness that Zhou had on behalf of the Chinese people, and to the fact that it wasn't only Westerners or white people who looked down on China and Chinese men for this reason, but also the Japanese, marking therefore China's disgraceful fall to a lower position in the hierarchy of East Asian nations and societies. So for Zhou, as I've written here, and for his fellow revolutionaries, the queue was a mark of servitude that symbolized how the Manchus were holding China back. And this cartoon, Chinese cartoon that appeared in a newspaper, a Chinese newspaper, in this early 20th century, shows the weakness of a Qing dynastic, of the Qing dynasty and of the Chinese people at large. All a Westerner had to do to cripple China or a Chinese man, to make him cry like a baby, was to step on his queue and essentially immobilize him. This turn of the century photograph really captured my interest, and I think it does a very good job too of capturing what was a transitory moment, a moment of sort of overlap of different systems of meaning and new interlocking of different parts of the globe. So we see this man, this gentleman, he's clearly an educated figure, painting in the Western style, not in the traditional Chinese style. Therefore, in a sense, reaching out to the larger world, joining in currents that flowed from China outward and outward into China, and yet still wearing the queue. So he's part modern, and he's part not modern. And as I said, I think this captures this kind of transitional moment very effectively. Well, by 1911, the revolutionaries had gained enough strength that they were able to finally topple the Qing dynasty, which by this point in time had become very weak. I'd point out here that the soldiers who managed the overthrow of the Qing dynasty wore their hair short. So the revolution then of 1911, which overthrew the Qing dynasty, which cast out the Manchus and brought in Han Chinese leadership in the name of a new style, Western style, democratic republic, all of this too was accompanied by very visual change in the way men appeared. And typically since that point in time, in Chinese context at least, this shift in hairstyle has been portrayed as a form of liberation. The queue then symbolizes the nation, and the Western-dressed Chinese man is bringing his compatriot or bringing China into modernity by cutting off his long braid. But I'd point out that not everyone was entirely pleased by this change. As I've mentioned, people had grown fond of their queues. They were part of their identities. They were not something that necessarily people objected to any longer. It was the revolutionaries who represented a segment of the Chinese population, but only a segment, who used the queue as a sort of rallying point for opposing the Qing dynasty. It was not everybody. And to lose one's queue could be shocking. And as I mentioned, a challenge to one's sense of self, to their identity. Well, as the Manchus, when they established the Qing dynasty, had done, the revolutionaries also enforced, and I want to underline the word force here, a new hairstyle on the Chinese male population. In some places, shorn hair became a prerequisite for voting. The revolution brought in elections, and in order to participate in the modern institution of the election, you had to have cut your hair. We also see all over China that when police arrested people for any crime, one of the things they did when booking them into jail or so forth was cut their hair. This became something over which people had no control. Now, certainly we don't have anything as draconian as the Qing threat that if you don't cut your hair, you will be executed. But here again, we see the imposition on people who were not necessarily ready for it or desirous of it, of a new hairstyle. And this, too, I think we need to understand, was, while on the one hand liberating, it was also an act of force that was taking place. But the new hairstyle and the dress style that went with it was no more Chinese than the Q originally had been. The Q, as I mentioned, I think becomes naturalized as Chinese, but originally, of course, it was not Chinese. It was another foreign style, that is the modern Western style. And so in both instances, what we see is that the Chinese were forced to wear their hair in a style that wasn't necessarily congenial to them. Now, many people after the 1911 revolution voluntarily and happily cut their hair. But what I'm trying to make clear here is that this wasn't something that all people did. Not all people understood the revolution the same way, and not all people understood the Q as a mark of servitude and submission to the Manchus. So in the end, I would suggest that hair, the most intimate of things, part of our bodies, had become in both instances, or throughout this period, was a politicized symbol. Hairstyle was not about making a personal statement. It was not about, here's who I am, here's my identity. Although, as I've mentioned during the Qing, it did become a status symbol, and people did begin to take pride in it. Nevertheless, you had to wear your hair in a certain style. So the Q was all about belonging to a particular political order by accepting an imposed disciplinary regime. It was a way of enforcing conformity. As a final thought, I thought it would be interesting to observe that a modern equivalent of this, close to home, here in the United States, and in particular in the United States military and in militaries throughout the world, there's a similarity here. A shaved head is imposed on people who are entering the army, and they must maintain it that way, for disciplinary reasons. I don't mean by that they are being punished, but their bodies are being disciplined such that they conform to a particular look and style. You are to be a member of a group. You are not to be an individual. Your own self-expression is not important here. Instead, your conformity is what's required. So the hair, or lack of it in this case, defines the organizational man. Now we'll stop with that. Thank you very much.